So Congressman Matt Gaetz just gave this pretty wide-ranging speech that really it touched on everything from a potential war with Iran all the way to the internal fights shaping the Republican Party. So what was his actual message? Well, what we're going to do here is break down the key arguments, the main themes, and his big calls to action to figure that out. Right out of the gate, Gauze hits with this really stark warning on foreign policy. It's a powerful way to start, and it pretty much frames his whole argument. For him, this isn't just some abstract political debate. It's a direct threat to the financial security and, the actual safety of everyday Americans. Okay, so to make sense of all this, here's how we're going to break it down. We're going to walk through 5 core themes. First up, that big warning on Iran. Then we'll get into his domestic agenda, the fight for free speech, what he thinks the Republican Party should do next, and finally, his big call to action for the midterms. All right, so let's dive into that first part, the warning on Iran. Gaetz puts this issue right at the top, basically arguing that the threat of war isn't some far-off possibility, but a real and present danger. Now, to show this isn't just him talking hypothetically, he points to a specific number. He brings up a polymarket prediction that, at the time, was showing a 71% chance of U.S. ground troops heading into Iran. For him, that number is basically a flashing red light, a signal that we urgently need to reject a military option. And he gets really specific about what he thinks would happen. Gaetz argues an invasion would hit Americans right in the wallet. Think higher gas prices, higher food prices. And on top of that, he warns it would actually be counterproductive, maybe even creating more terrorists than it eliminates, and just repeating the same costly mistakes he sees from the past in Iraq and Afghanistan. And, he wraps up his point on Iran with that classic provocative Gaetz style. With this quote, he's using some pretty unconventional, surprising language to suggest that maybe military force isn't the only path to what he'd call a successful outcome. It's a really clear example of him using a bit of shock value to make his point unforgettable. Okay, so after laying out that really serious warning on foreign policy, the speech takes a hard turn. The big question then becomes, what about here at home? What's his vision for America's domestic priorities? And that brings us right to his second big theme, what's going on here at home. This is where he pivots to a sharp critique of how the government is working or not working and lays out his own list of priorities. First up, he goes right after government shutdowns. He doesn't see them as some clever legislative tool, but as a total failure that just hurts regular people. He uses the image of unpaid TSA workers and huge lines at the airport. He's really painting this picture of how, in his view, the gridlock in D.C. has these very real consequences for everybody else. And to really drive this point home, he uses this pretty wild contrast. He argues that while the Senate couldn't find time to deal with things like voter ID laws, they did find time for this, a Mardi Gras-themed dog parade. For Gaetz, this whole thing is the perfect example of a major disconnect in Washington's priorities. So, okay, what's his solution? What does he want to see happen instead? Well, he lays out this really clear, immediate to-do list. Number 1, reopen the government. And right after that, pass what he's calling the Save America Act, which is all about election integrity. We're talking mandatory voter ID and requiring proof of citizenship. All right, so from there, the speech kind of zooms out from specific policies to this much broader ideological fight. This next section is all about what Gaetz sees as the central battle of our time, the fight for free speech. And he frames this whole fight by setting up a contrast between 2 different eras. On one hand, he talks about the Biden years, which he describes as a time when, in his words, conservatives got labeled domestic terrorists just for having certain views. And he contrasts that with what he calls the Trump-Vance era, which he describes as the return of free speech. Now, a really key piece of this free speech argument is what he has to say about certain institutions. He gives a shout out to the FBI for a decision they made to end their partnership with the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL. And this really sets the stage for a very powerful statement. And here's that statement directly from him. He's basically saying this is why the FBI should never work with the organization, and in the process, he levels a very direct and a very serious accusation against the ADL. Okay, next up, Gaetz turns his focus inward. He starts talking directly to his own party. He lays out a whole strategic vision for how he thinks Republicans should be using their power right now. And he asks this really fundamental question. For Gaetz, just having a majority isn't the point. The real question is, what are you going to do with it? His whole point is that they need to be way more aggressive, way more proactive. And his answer is this 4-part strategy for action. First, he tells them to take the majority out for a spin. No more breaks or vacations until key bills are passed. He says they should be working every single day to turn former President Trump's executive orders into actual laws. And finally, he wants them to use tactics to force Democrats into long, public, talking filibusters. But this is where it gets pretty interesting, because he touches on this kind of tension within his own message. He calls for an end to what he calls cancel culture on the right, saying there has to be room for disagreement inside the party. But then, in the very next breath, he says he'd walk arm in arm with those same people if it means achieving the bigger goal, which, for him, is stopping the Democrats. And that idea of unity leads us right into his final theme. The whole speech wraps up not with policy points, but with this big, energetic call to action that's aimed squarely at the upcoming midterm elections. And to make his point really stick, he doesn't throw out a bunch of stats or political theories. Instead, he tells this simple story about a conversation he had with a barista in a coffee shop out in Iowa. And here's the punchline. So this barista's promise, right, it becomes a symbol for the exact kind of passionate, all-hands-on-deck mobilization he's trying to inspire. You know, getting everyone you know, and even the people you used to know, to get involved. And that's his final direct order to the audience. He takes that barista's idea and just runs with it. And he turns it into this really memorable, urgent call for everyone to rally their entire network to get out and vote. And that really brings us back to the central question that seems to pop up again and again throughout his speech. From his foreign policy arguments to his strategy for his own party, there's this recurring theme. It leaves you with this one big thing to think about. Is the best way to create unity really to focus on a common enemy?